This presentation is brought to you by Arizona State University's Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability and a generous investment by Julianne Wrigley.
Okay, but now let me switch to some of the environmental questions of animal production. Firstly, there are local issues which are worth attention. A lot of different local issues. This just shows water pollution. This is a holding lagoon. This is not actually just going into a river. This is an intensive farm. But it goes into one of these so-called lagoons. I was always puzzled when I first saw the word lagoon used in this context, but that's what they call them. Here's another slide which talks about lagoons. This is an overview of a giant intensive pig farm. You see these sheds here. Each one of those sheds, each one of these sites holds 8,000 hogs, and there's more of them. There's another set there. There's another one over here. There's probably one back there behind that lagoon. So it's a very large thing, and these so-called lagoons are holding basically the pig manure with water. And the idea is that it should then be sort of sprayed on surrounding fields. But what sometimes happens is you get big storms and the lagoons overflow. It gets into the water supply. Or you have so many hogs in such a dense area that the manure is sprayed too thickly on surrounding fields for the fields to be able to use, because it costs money to transport it further. And so when it rains, it runs off the fields and into the streams and pollutes the streams. So where there are these intensive industries, there are big water pollution problems. And that's a significant local issue. There are other environmental issues too. There's air pollution for the people who are close in the neighborhood. There's questions about water use, which are very relevant here in dry states like Arizona. But I want to move, whoops, sorry, that was too fast. I want to move to looking at what is the most pressing environmental issue that faces us and the world today, and that is climate change. So here I didn't show you before cattle production. It's less intensive than pig, egg, chicken production or veal production, but it's still highly intensive. This is a cattle feedlot, again, a vast thing stretching into the horizon. Maybe 100,000 cattle confined in this area. They do have room to move around. They are outside, but it's still a pretty dull kind of existence for them. And they're being fed on grain and some soy, which fattens them up faster, but they don't digest very well. Also, they produce a lot of manure. And the other thing is, cattle produce a lot of methane. Cattle produce methane in their digestive process. It's a gas. Most of it, actually, contrary to myth, comes from belching rather than out of the other end. But they do produce methane, and methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas. So we have to look at that. We also have the fact that, as I said, it's not really an efficient form of producing food to feed grain or soy to ruminant animals in particular. And that has an impact on on greenhouse gases as well, because we use a lot of fertilizers to grow our grain and transport our grain, and so that contributes to fossil fuel, especially if you consider that we're actually wasting most of the food value of this grain. So here are some figures on that. We are actually feeding 70% of the grain we produce to animals rather than eating it directly, or now some of it, of course, is going into biofuel, ethanol, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But of this, we're only getting back about 1/6 of the food value, or actually less than 1/6 if you're talking about overall food value, which includes carbohydrate. But since people say, well, we eat beef for its protein, that's what's important. Even if we just focus on protein, we could get, we are wasting a lot of the protein value of the grains and soy we're feeding to cattle. So it's a very inefficient process. Another way of looking at that is by asking how much protein can you get per acre if you use your acre for different kinds of usage. And soybeans come out by far the best, followed by rice and corn, and then peas and beans, the legumes, wheat, and it's only these bars down the bottom, if you're up the back and have trouble seeing, this is milk here, this is eggs, this is meat, all types of meat, and this is beef in particular. So, all of these columns are the direct consumption of plant products, and these ones are the meat production because of the wastefulness of feeding grain to meat. So that clearly has an environmental impact, puts more stress on the environment that we need to grow more in order to get these amounts of food. Okay, let's go back to climate change. It's only relatively recently that people have started to talk about how important an issue the food we eat is in a contribution to climate change. Most people have thought for years that it's things like transport that are the big factors. The fact that we drive these gas-guzzling SUVs, the fact that we all have our own cars rather than using public transport, and so on. But as the UN Food and Agriculture Organization has said quite recently, actually the livestock sector is bigger than all transport, both private and public transport. The livestock sector is a bigger contributor to greenhouse gas emissions measured in CO2 equivalent. So what you do is you convert the methane to carbon dioxide. Much smaller amounts of methane produced than carbon dioxide, but it's a much more potent greenhouse gas. And that's why it comes out as a higher figure. So this is going to be significant. If we want to deal with this immense problem, which I think is one of the great challenges for us I think climate change is already with us, already happening. We can't stop it, but we can at least try and mitigate it so that it doesn't get worse, so that it doesn't spiral unpredictably out of hand with things like changes in ocean currents, rising sea levels. On one model, for example, rising sea levels over the next century could put a third of the state of Florida underwater, and that would be much worse even for other countries where poorer people cannot move. For example, Bangladesh has tens of millions of people living on land that is no more than 3 meters above sea level. That's because it has all these very fertile delta regions that they farm, but they're very low-lying. So this is a major crisis which will affect hundreds of millions of people, billions of people, and this is one thing we can do about it, changing our diet to make it less livestock intensive.
This presentation is brought to you by Arizona State University's Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability for educational and non-commercial use only.